Everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the May Catalyst seminar and introduce Aleisha Clarke and Tom McBride from the Early Intervention Foundation who are giving the seminar for us. Aleisha is Assistant Director and Early Intervention Foundation's lead on mental health and well-being. And Tom McBride is the Early Intervention Foundation's Director of Evidence, but we'll be moving on end of this month, at which point Aleisha will take on Tom's role. For those of you who don't know, Early Intervention Foundation is a government What Works Centre that is dedicated to ensuring the effective early intervention being available and being used to support children at risk of both at risk of poor outcomes. And as knowledge broker, they sit at the interface between research and policy, and they generate evidence on their three strategic themes, which are the early years, mental health and well-being, and also childhood vulnerability. And they work closely with national and local government, practitioners, and the third sector to ensure that evidence is used to improve the way we design and deliver services for children. So work that is highly relevant for many of us who work in children and young people's mental health. I strongly encourage everyone to visit their website and take a look at the resources that are available there, which include reports, briefings, introductory information sheets, and also resources for policymakers. And they really are truly excellent and worth looking at. I also want to note that the Early Intervention Foundation have been meeting with UCL's children and young people mental health representatives. So we really hope to build strong links between the Early Intervention Foundation and UCL, which would include opportunities for collaboration and opportunities for students to learn about and engage in policy research and also other initiatives. And today, Aleisha and Tom will tell us about the role of Early Intervention Foundation and the What Works network. Also, their work on social and emotional learning and adolescent mental health, the strengths and limitations of the knowledge broker model in translating and mobilizing evidence, and also how, in their view, academic research could have a greater influence on policy and practice, which is surely highly relevant for all of us. So welcome to you both, and we really look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Essie. So I'm going to make a start. I'm just going to share a screen. Essie, can you see that? Great. Okay. So I'm just going to start by building on what Essie just introduced there, just giving you a little bit more background into the Early Intervention Foundation and the work that we do. And then I'm going to talk specifically about the work that we've been doing over the last 2 years in relation to adolescent mental health. So as Essie mentioned, we're an independent charity and we're part of the government's What Works network. And this network was established by the UK government in 2013. And really within that, the centre's role is to assess the existing evidence base in relation to a specific policy area, and then to offer advice to government on effective practice. So we provide that independent assessment of effective practice in the area of early intervention. So as Essie mentioned, our vision is that all children are able to achieve their full potential. And our mission is to ensure that effective early intervention is available and is used to improve the lives of children and young people, in particular those who are at risk of poor outcomes. So when we talk about early intervention, what exactly do we mean as an organisation? So our definition is really around identifying and providing early support to children and young people who are at risk of poor outcomes. And these outcomes can be across a number of areas, including mental health, academic attainment, involvement in crime and antisocial behaviour. And really it's about providing support, evidence-based support, before problems become entrenched and costly to government. So our work can include a wide range of programmes and practices, for example, home visiting programmes to support vulnerable parents, It can include school-based. We do quite a bit in school-based, social emotional learning interventions. It can include supporting children's early language development. And we're not just about the early years, despite the fact that we do consider it to be hugely important, really critical. We do believe that early intervention can have an important role to play in both children and young people's outcomes. So we focus on children from, pregnancy, when the mother is pregnant, right through to the age of 18. A key part of the work we do is around effectiveness, and we define effectiveness as providing evidence of improving outcomes for children and young people. So much of our EIF work focuses on assessing the effectiveness of interventions in the space, and then making that evidence transparent and accessible to quite a wide audience. So just briefly, in terms of the outcomes that we're concerned with as an organisation, I suppose it sits across 4 core domains: children and young people's cognitive, behavioural, social, emotional and physical outcomes. So just to kind of give you a sense of how does our work look within the organisation. So we describe our work under 3 core areas. And this really drives our overall work programme on an annual basis. The first one is making the case for early intervention, and this is about providing evidence-based arguments that really make that social and economic case for investing in early intervention. So it's about demonstrating where evidence has proven that early intervention can make a difference, but also being able to highlight where the evidence is less strong. And in addition to that, I suppose, trying to kind of get at why results haven't materialised in the area of early intervention. So just some examples of work in this space. In 2018, we produced a report on realising the potential of early intervention, and this really sets out the role of early intervention in improving outcomes for children and young people. We identify some of the barriers at that kind of system level, and also the key actions at both national and local level to really push the agenda of early intervention forward. And then more recently, we've produced a briefing for government on the case for early intervention to support levelling up and the COVID recovery. And this again sets out some key action areas across parenting interventions, school-based interventions, where government can really make a difference in the context of early intervention. The second focus of our work is around generating evidence, and this would be, the vast majority of our work within the evidence team. And as part of this work, we do quite a lot on synthesizing the evidence base with a focus on what works, understanding what works for whom and under what circumstances. But we do quite a bit of work outside of just synthesizing the evidence base, looking at workforce practice, what practices are likely to be effective, and then also at that system level, so trying to understand how to create effective systems to support early intervention. I suppose the one area that we currently do less work on, but we're particularly interested in moving into is building on the evidence synthesis and really getting into that territory of commissioning research and conducting primary research to address some of the gaps in early intervention that we're identifying through our reviews. So some examples of kind of we've done quite a number of evidence reviews across parenting interventions, early childhood education, adolescent mental health, which I'll talk about, virtual and digital delivery of early interventions. So quite a lot of kind of evidence reviews that you'll see on our website. And the third core area really builds on the work that we do within the evidence team around generating evidence. And this is about trying to use evidence to change policy and practice. And we do that in a number of ways. We work quite closely with policymakers and with central government to ensure that evidence can be taken into account when making decisions, and also when thinking about funding. We also work with workforce bodies and charities, and this is about trying to influence the influencers, so trying to disseminate our evidence to various organisations to support them in changing practice. And then we do more recently more and more work with local areas, so working directly with local areas to support them firstly in understanding the evidence base, which is hugely important, and then applying that to their local practice, and also supporting them in trying to generate their own evidence. Probably, I won't go through all of the examples here, but one example, one of our kind of biggest products is our EIF Guidebook, and this is a database of interventions in the early intervention space, which have been evaluated and shown to improve children and young people's outcomes. So over 100 interventions on our guidebook at the moment. And really this is for commissioners, supporting them in making evidence-based decisions around the types of interventions that could be implemented based on the need of their local population. So moving on to the work that we do in relation to adolescent mental health. So what I'm going to do is just give you kind of an overview of the work we've done over the last 2 years. And I think it gives kind of a flavour for how we move between these 3 core areas of work when thinking about a piece of research. The rationale for us doing work in the adolescent mental health space over the last 2 years, I suppose firstly, really the vast majority of our work in terms of mental health was particularly focused around children's mental health. So we've done quite a lot of work in primary schools to support children's social emotional learning. Huge number of our interventions on our guidebook are focused on interventions being implemented in primary schools, with very little prior to this work around secondary schools. And this for us was in one way kind of, I suppose, a gap in our evidence work, and something that we wanted to address, particularly with government being able to respond to government's requests around what works to support adolescent mental health outcomes. So as part of that work, we looked at both the policy and practice landscape. And, over the last few years, we've seen considerable political interest and concern about young people's mental health. And in terms of, I suppose, the policy context, when we speak to the likes of the Department of Education, we could see that, they were very clearly focused on the implementation of the Transforming Children and Young People's Mental Health Green Paper commitments. So that was the rollout of the designated senior leads for mental health and the mental health support teams in school. And that was really important for us to consider that in the context of the work that we were planning. And then I suppose talking to, practitioners on the ground in schools, we were, a lot of the feedback was that there's a confusing array of information sources and program providers selling their products to schools. And it can be very difficult for schools to have the time, to have the headspace to think about the evidence base in the context of interventions that are being implemented in schools. And, feedback we were getting was, if there was any way to support them in doing that, so that would be helpful. So we proposed to the Department of Education that we would conduct an evidence review on the effectiveness of secondary school mental health interventions, and off the back of that we would develop guidance for secondary schools. And as part of this planning process, we thought about, what are our long-term aims, and we think about it in terms of various different audiences. So what is it that we want national policymakers to do or to change in relation to their behaviour as a result of us doing an evidence review and producing guidance? So we wanted them to better understand what the evidence tells us about school-based mental health support, and then to use that evidence in future policy decision making. And then thinking about, the broader sector, the other charities in this space, we want them equally to understand what the evidence is telling us in the context of schools, and to reflect that in their own work and in conversations and advice that they're also having with government, and also at that local practice level with schools. So ultimately, in the longer term, what we're thinking about is we want schools to be able to make more evidence-informed decisions about what they do and how they do that. So that's through, providing core information on from the evidence review, but also more importantly through the guidance that we're currently producing. And ultimately combined, this we believe will increase investment in more effective early intervention, which will in turn lead to improved outcomes for children and young people. So we kind of try to set out our logic model through our programs of work early on in the planning stage. So how do we plan to achieve this? Well, firstly, making the case and generating evidence, and I'll talk about that a little. Then we move into kind of using that evidence to change practice. So this was the producing guidance that we are currently doing this year. And a key part of the work that we do is collaboration. And that, I suppose, realization for us that we don't have strong links with schools as a work centre, that they're not our direct audience. So it was important for us to collaborate with, be it another What's Work centre or another organisation that really had those direct links. And I've mentioned this already, you know, understanding context is just so important in relation to the work that we do. So understanding the political context and the context of schools. So throughout our work, we actively engage with policymakers, sector experts, and practitioners and young people, really to ensure that our work responds to that wider context. So firstly, we set out with planning our systematic, our evidence review. But prior to doing that, we set out to produce 2 briefings. And these were really about making the case to government around investing in adolescent mental health. So the first evidence brief looked at the prevalence of disorders in adolescence. And the second evidence brief looked at the long-term associations between adolescent mental health outcomes, mental health problems, and long-term associations with adult outcomes. And the rationale for doing that was no more than for schools and there being a confusing array of kind of interventions and information. It's quite similar at that policy level. There's, you know, you could argue a confusing array of cohort studies, longitudinal studies, which present findings on these topics. And it can be very difficult for policymakers to, you know, understand and not necessarily understand, but be able to kind of collate those figures and see what's the latest data on prevalence and long-term associations. And really, without having access to this kind of data, it can be very difficult to make evidence-based arguments for the need to invest in mental health. So we produced these evidence briefs, which presented the data on prevalence with, you know, we primarily looked at the mental health of children and young people, and it had the advantage of presenting that data across multiple waves. So we were able to look at trends and look in particular at the latest data, which took place during lockdown 2020. So that was our first evidence briefing. The second one was looking at the relationship between mental health problems in adolescents and adult outcomes. And again, it was about trying to kind of collate the data and make it as accessible as possible to the policy audience. So it was looking at 72 studies across using longitudinal data sets. We were looking at mental health outcomes, education, employment outcomes, and physical health and broader social outcomes in adulthood. And I suppose this briefing really helped us to make that case for early intervention, because it was really through this that we could see that young people at that subclinical level were at high risk of negative adult outcomes. And, you know, we were able to kind of make that case around there. They're most likely to receive, less likely to receive intervention support. So, you know, it's just making those arguments around the need for investing in early intervention. Then we moved on to our evidence generation aspect, and this was our systematic review of what works in the school setting. So we were looking at what works to support adolescent mental health. But in addition to that, we really wanted to get at for whom do these interventions work in the school context and under what circumstances. So looking at characteristics, but also most importantly, you know, looking at the conditions under which programs have been proven to be effective. It's often, you know, there's less of a focus on that, and we really need to see, you know, how should we be implementing and rolling out these programs in the school setting. And as part of that, we identified gaps in the evidence base and looked at directions for future research. So it was both a review of reviews and a review of primary studies. So we looked at 35 systematic reviews, which were published since 2010, and looked at 97 primary studies, which had been published in the last 7 years, almost like a top up of, you know, the evidence coming through from the systematic reviews. We looked at interventions which are designed to enhance mental health and well-being, to prevent mental health difficulties, and also to prevent behavioural difficulties. In terms of their focus, we looked at universal and targeted interventions. I'm not going to go through all of the findings. I won't bore you with the details, but I'm just going to pull out some of the kind of findings that came through from the evidence review, because I think it'll help in kind of giving an insight into how we then think about policy recommendations for government. So in terms of promoting young people's mental health and well-being, when we looked at the evidence base, we could see there's a range of approaches that are being implemented in secondary schools. And this looks like, you know, you have social emotional learning interventions, you've positive psychology, you've mindfulness-based interventions, positive youth development and mental health literacy psychoeducation interventions. And really the evidence base is quite varied. So there's good evidence that's social emotional learning interventions, which are focused on kind of the enhancement of those skills. They seem to enhance social emotional skills and reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety in the short term. In terms of mindfulness-based interventions, and we're hearing from schools that these really have grown in popularity over the recent years. And it was interesting that the evidence was quite mixed in terms of their effectiveness at the universal level in improving mental health and wellbeing outcomes, and that they seem to be most effective in enhancing cognitive capacity, so attention and the likes of working memory. When we looked at positive youth development interventions, there was an array of intervention types in this, the likes of, mentoring interventions, sports, recreation interventions, social action type interventions, all with kind of a focus on enhancing mental well-being outcomes. These really had quite limited evidence of effectiveness. And then the final set with mental health literacy interventions, whilst they were effective in enhancing knowledge about mental health, as they are designed to do, they seem to have very limited evidence in terms of having an impact on stigma and health-seeking behaviour. And then in relation to specific interventions which were designed to reduce mental health difficulties, so interventions which were targeted at those who were identified as having subclinical symptoms, we could see that cognitive behavioural therapy-based interventions were effective in reducing symptoms of depression and anxiety when they were delivered by an external professional. And this was quite an important finding for us to relay to government, that they were shown to not be effective when they were delivered by the class teacher, by teaching staff. And there was very limited evidence on the effectiveness of interventions which were designed to prevent suicide and self-harm. And really, the issue here was that the studies are of weak quality. There's a real need to invest in high quality interventions. In addition to looking at the what works I mentioned, we also looked at for whom and under what circumstances. And in terms of the under what circumstances, we could see that universal interventions can be delivered successfully by teachers. But again, that point on the need for external professionals. And this was important for, given the government is rolling out the mental health support teams as part of schools, it's important for that kind of message to be relayed. We could see that the impact of depression, anxiety interventions and violence prevention interventions tended to be stronger when they were targeted at high-risk young people. And really, we saw a limited number of interventions which report evidence of improving outcomes for vulnerable groups of young people, and an even smaller number of interventions which are specifically designed for these groups of young people. And then a final point on, under what circumstances, something that started to kind of come out from a number of studies that actually looked at it. There's a very limited number of studies which look at the impact of implementation on programme outcomes. But studies that did, actually we could see that quality of implementation is crucial for achieving programme outcomes. And where quality was low, they didn't see an impact. So again, this was an important finding. So a key part of what we do when we do these the likes of these evidence reviews is think very carefully about the implications that we're making to policymakers and trying to make them as actionable as possible. So the first key message that we needed to get across to DfE was really to think about incentivizing and supporting the use of programs which have an established evidence of improving young people's outcomes, that the evidence is quite mixed here. And, we can see there's certain approaches that are ahead of the pack, and we should be incentivizing these. Another point we made was around the need to support schools to address the needs of pupils at multiple levels. That one intervention brought into a school, into a classroom curriculum for a 12-week period is unlikely to have that kind of impact that we would like, and that we need to embed these interventions within that whole school approach, so operating at that ethos and environment level, and really trying to kind of extend those supports to the family and reinforce strategies in the home environment. Another recommendation we made was the need to develop teachers' skills and confidence in relation to supporting young people's mental health, and at the same time providing that external mental health expertise to support those who are most vulnerable. And a final point for government on focusing on high quality implementation And providing schools with implementation support. It's not enough just to provide them with an evidence-based intervention, but we have to do more to build that readiness for change among staff, to support them in developing that action plan and addressing barriers to implementation that arise during the implementation process. So not stepping away once we've carried out that kind of initial training. And then we made a series of recommendations about, areas for future research that, we do need to consider in the context of adolescent mental health. So in terms of then influencing policy, I won't go through this in huge detail, but as part of thinking about, our policy recommendations, we then set out a policy plan on how we will go about trying to influence policy. It's extremely challenging, I would say. And one of the kind of issues that we have is that, as you're aware, mental health the responsibility sits across multiple departments, the Department for Education, the Department for Health and Social Care, the new Office for Health Promotion. So it can be difficult to bring all of those departments together and work with them kind of as a unit. Often, our meetings are kind of on an individual basis. But we set out kind of a series of short-term and long-term aims in relation to the evidence review. So things like having briefing sessions with the various departments and really focusing in on, their areas of interest in terms of, was it mental health or was it the behaviour team we were presenting our findings to? We presented to NHS England and the Office for Health Promotion. Our comms and press activity around this was important in terms of launching the evidence review. So things like social media, writing blogs and translating some of the messages, boiling them down to kind of some key messages and translating that for that broader audience. And I suppose another action for us was through advisory boards that we sit on, trying to kind of get the key messages coming out of the evidence review and try and ensure that they're heard at the likes of, providing input into the NICE guidance. We sit on the Behaviour Hub steering group at DFE, so ensuring that some of those behaviour messages were being heard at those types of planning meetings. And then in terms of, I suppose, longer term, it's really about trying to nurture those relationships across the various policy teams and trying to build our network through this work. So just some kind of, I suppose, reflections, and I think Tom will talk more about this, but, reflections on the work that we did in the context of adolescent mental health and trying to influence policy work. I suppose the first point is this work is ongoing. Like we published the report over 2 years ago. It's a year ago, sorry. Feels like 2. The work is ongoing, trying to work with policy. We still are meeting with the various policy teams and building off, the findings coming through from the evidence review. I've mentioned it already. I think it's hugely important in the work that we do, understanding the policy context and current priorities. I suppose framing the work that we do, not just in the academic context, but also in that policy context as well. It's a fairly obvious one, the importance that we produce high quality research, but it's also, high quality research that considers those practical implications for policy and practice. It's just hugely important to have those kind of translated messages for government. Communicating well, obviously making the research as relevant and readable to your policy and practice audience as possible. Engaging in that effective dissemination, so thinking about dissemination plans, considering the outputs and the audiences that we want to reach through this work. And I suppose that, probably the most important part is the kind of building of the relationships and thinking about it as like long-term networks that you can, that can support you, I suppose, in getting better access to opportunities to shape agendas and to engage in further policy conversations. So just to give you kind of an overview of the work that we're doing this year, kind of off the back of the evidence review. So we obviously had our evidence review, the ongoing policy influencing, and over the last 12 months, we've been working heavily on producing this practical guidance for secondary school teachers. And this is really, it's been informed by the evidence base, and we could see that there's an array of guidance and support for mental health leads, the pastoral team at school level, but actually very little practical advice for your everyday curriculum teacher, not just those with responsibility for mental health. So this work is really about what is it that every classroom teacher can do in supporting a positive classroom environment, in enhancing that teacher-pupil relationship, and really about trying to build teachers' confidence in how they can support young people's mental health through their everyday interactions. So as I mentioned, we're providing very practical, evidence-informed strategies, and this guidance has been informed really by the evidence review, and we've conducted a kind of a light touch common elements of the evidence-based interventions which have emerged from a review, looking at what are the kind of core practices taught in these interventions and how can we then turn them into practical strategies for teachers. So we've worked very closely with teachers and young people on this guidance. They've shaped the questions that we're asking and also the type of guidance that we're providing, alongside some expert opinion as well. So this guidance we're about to launch in about a month's time, and this is very much the start of the journey for us. I mentioned already, you know, we're collaborating with Anna Freud on this because we're not that direct link into schools, but Anna Freud, you know, just are, and they've just got those fantastic connections and that expertise. So we will launch the guidance with Anna Freud, and then begin to think about how we can support the uptake of the guidance, because it's not just a matter of disseminating the guidance, no more than, you know, the work that we do with policymakers, but actually how do we support it actually being taken up in schools. So we're starting to think about some knowledge mobilization activities, the likes of having, you know, expert input through webinars and podcasts for different audiences at the school level, providing video case studies for schools on how to implement the guidance. What would it look like, you know, in practice if you're a maths teacher, a physics teacher, and then some self-assessment tools that teachers might like to use. And then the final point is just around, you know, it's an area where we're doing more and more thinking around is how do we monitor impact as well? So, you know, how can we determine you know, how much teachers are engaged with the guidance and ultimately the degree to which it's having an impact on practice and outcomes. So that's something that we're starting to think more about with Anna Freud and this work. So Tom, I think it's over to you. I'm just going to unshare. There we go.
Great, and let's save all the questions until the end. You're very welcome to post them on the chat or be poised to ask them in person if you'd like.
Thanks very much, Aleisha. Can't seem to turn my video on, not that anybody particularly needs to see me. And sharing it. Sorry, Zoom's coming back to life for me. Just give me 1 second. Sharing seems to have been disabled for me.
Does it work now?
Let me just try. I think we've got over these things by now, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I mean, you're co-host, so you should be able to share. And I've also clicked the multiple people can share button.
Zoom is just not doing anything for me.
If it doesn't work, maybe Aleisha can just do the slides. I know it's clunky that way.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
No problem.
If she's able to. Yeah, there we are.
Aha, brilliant. So yeah, so as Aleisha said, I'm just going to say a little bit about not so much about our work on mental health and well-being so much, but more about our role within the evidence ecosystem, I suppose, or, you know, and what we try to do, what what Work Network is, I suppose. You know, we're often described as a knowledge broker or an evidence intermediary. I think both are somewhat pretentious terms, but I definitely don't have a better one. I wanted to say a little bit about, well, what is a knowledge broker? And I was sort of dreading coming up with a definition for it, but luckily the OECD have already done it for me. I don't think this is absolutely perfect, but it's better than I could do. You know, it talks about this idea of organisations that exist to increase the availability of robust knowledge and build capabilities. And I think that's very much what we focus on, sitting at that interface between research and the policy making, having people with deep expertise in the research, often who come from a career in academia, but also people who really understand national and local government, who've come from a career in the civil service or local government. So we can try and bridge those two worlds, I suppose. So Aleisha, if you don't mind skipping on. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess the What Works network and what some of the strengths of that, and then also some of the challenges and issues we face. What are the advantages of having these organisations in the world? So I've talked about the first there, those hopefully by having both expertise in research and the policy landscape, that we can really make sure that robust evidence and research is used to inform social policy. We're experienced in translating complex messages for lay audiences. Hopefully we've got a good understanding of how civil servants and ministers and so on think and engage with evidence. We know about the policy making process. We know how to translate, hopefully, research into actionable recommendations, as Aleisha said. If we have that strong focus on knowledge mobilisation, we really try to build that into the start of our projects. We think very hard about who we want to influence and what the best mechanisms for influencing those individuals might be. And that really does come down sometimes for us for naming specific people, specific ministers, civil servants, and so on that we want to engage with this and target. And as I've said, we've got those strong links to central and local government, but also practitioner bodies, third sector organisations, and so on. So hopefully, we are well positioned to get evidence into social policy. But it'd be far from a perfect system. I think it's worth acknowledging that many centres get significant levels of funding from central government. We certainly do. That's really positive in terms of direct influence into central government, but it'd be naive to think that funding doesn't influence both the research that we do and the topics that we look at and what we say publicly as well. And I think that there are some limitations to think about there. I think we can be perceived as having a narrow focus on experimental methods. I think this is a little bit unfair. I think we have a nuanced view of evidence and what types of evidence are most applicable to what sorts of questions. But inherent in the name What Works Centre, it implies an idea that we are interested primarily in causality and a narrow set of methods which are generally accepted in evidence hierarchies as establishing causality. Our evidence standards can be seen as somewhat unattainable. So to get a level for EIF to describe something as working, it would have to have at least one high quality RCT behind it. We would look at that RCT in some forensic detail to understand how good it was. If you're a small provider of mental health services, at a regional level, thinking about how you would ever get to that standard must be quite daunting. I think we can replicate some of the Whitehall silos. As Aleisha said, we're interested in conception to 18. There's at least 6 or 7 government departments who are interested in that age group, and many of them have their own What Works centres. That doesn't necessarily encourage holistic thinking about child development. And the final one, measuring impact on the social policy process, is just inherently difficult. So, the policy making process is a very messy landscape, I suppose. It is, it's easy to count who's engaging with your reports, how many ministers and civil servants you've seen, how many select committees you've been in front of, and so on and so forth. But it's very hard to trace the line between a piece of research and a new policy announcement. We're often, and no government department's ever going to come out and say, we have done this purely because of this single piece of research or this study or so on. So you might get cited, but you'll be cited alongside a lot of other stuff. So understanding that how you're impacting the process can be very difficult. And a lot of the influence we're trying to do is behind closed doors, trying to get civil servants to just engage with an evidence base and think about it critically and so on. So if we could move on, Aleisha. think I'll put animation in the next set of slides, which is going to make this even more difficult for you. So I wanted to start with, offering, I suppose, some challenges to researchers, to academics about how research could have more influence on social policy, or why it's so difficult to achieve that. And I guess I wanted to preface this by saying, I offer these as sort of provocations for discussion. I suppose I'm very happy for people to disagree or challenge these. And I say these as somebody on the outside looking in, I suppose, and to research and academia. So people may say they're just plain wrong. But from my perspective, I think first and foremost, it might be worth acknowledging the incentives to bring research to social policy can be limited. By which I mean not that people are uninterested in having an impact through their work, but that publications in high quality peer-reviewed journals, winning big grant awards, keynote speeches and so on, might be there might be greater incentive for people trying to build an academic career than appearing in front of a select committee or meeting a minister or talking to a middle ranking civil servant, for example. So I think I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's important to acknowledge that these are the rational response to many researchers working at least in universities might be to prioritise other courses of action, I suppose, rather than trying to engage with the messy and complex world of social policy. But there's a question about accessibility to research. I mean, first, a practical question about many journals are still behind paywalls. You can usually find a way around that if you try hard enough. But most civil servants, government departments, and so on, think tanks just won't have access to these. And then there's just a question about how easy it is to engage with that research. So I'm certainly not. Peer-reviewed articles should use technical language, should use equations and so on, which are not accessible to everybody. But even as somebody in the field, I regularly see journal titles where I just don't even understand. You understand what this research is about. And I think if you're using very technical language in a title or an abstract, it can give the impression to some outside of the world of academia that you're trying to talk to a very narrow group of individuals through this work. So I think it's just worth thinking about, are there subtle ways we could encourage more people to be engaging with the primary source of our research. Slightly controversial one, given my job title of Director of Evidence. When I wrote this third bullet, it said evidence rarely tells us anything, but I thought, do I want to be on the record saying that? I mean, what I'm trying to say here is, I've had a career, 20 years, trying to influence social policy and bring robust evidence to that. So I clearly think evidence is critically important. But if we think about the social policy process, nearly always what we're doing is trying to knit together quite a disparate sources of evidence, some of which will be quite old, all of which will be of varying quality, a lot of which will be produced outside of the UK. It rarely tells us exactly what the right course of action should be. I can genuinely count, I wouldn't even need a whole hand to count the number of times in my career that the evidence has unequivocally told us what the course of action should be. I think just acknowledging that ambiguity and understanding that is quite important. When I was a civil servant, colleagues used to say to me, "What does the evidence tell us?" And I used to sometimes think they had the impression that the evidence was a book that only me and my fellow analysts could read, but if we just looked hard enough, we would definitely find the answer to whatever obscure question they were asking of us. I think just understanding the limits of evidence and where it can and can't tell us, what it can and can't tell us, I suppose, in the social policy context is something important to acknowledge. And the fourth bullet I've said is research. Is further research always necessary? EIF is definitely guilty of this. Every report we've produced, in the last 5 years, or I've been there, has definitely made research recommendations. Of course, nobody gets to the end of a research project and think we've answered everything we would want to know. This doesn't prompt further questions. So yes, further research is nearly always necessary. But a lot of articles I read, really just sort of major on the research questions which stem from that research project, and very rarely say, well, what could we do with this? What does this tell us now for what we should be doing about social policy? And I think worth challenging ourselves, does that give the impression that research and academic research is just a self-fulfilling process, or a self-propagating process, which research serves the primary function of research is to just generate more research? And I think there might be a final bullet on here, Aleisha. The final one: who are you telling about your work? So I used to be a relatively senior civil servant in the Department for Education. In that role, I'd say several times a month I'd pick up on a piece of research or evidence and contact the authors of that work, try and have a discussion about the findings, where the work's going, and so on. Very, very rarely did anybody send me any research that they've done. Now, one explanation for that might be that I was just not very popular, or people didn't think I was very good. But my straw polling of colleagues would say that that's is similar for others. Most civil servants very rarely get contacted by research, even if they know them well. So I think it's worth thinking about, who are we trying to get to engage with this? Have we sent it to anybody outside of our academic circles, or are we relying on a more passive mechanism of engagement? So that's that. So I was going to sort of finish with some, having identified some challenges, some ideas of things we could do together or to influence policy more. Start with the build relationships with knowledge brokers. You'd expect me to say that, but as Essie said at the start, we're trying at the minute between EIF and UCL to build partnerships, to talk quite regularly about the work we're doing, look for shared ideas and opportunities to work together. Not necessarily with a huge agenda on that, but just to build those relationships. So where funding opportunities come up, those relationships are established, and that we can find ways of working together. The opposite of that, and the sort of partnership approach that I dislike the most, is when I get contacted, a week before a big grant application has to go in, with somebody saying, would you like to partner on this huge idea that I've just dropped on you? Because in that situation, that individual has just come towards the final stages of writing a grant and thought, what are we doing about impact? Let's try and involve somebody at the last minute. And we haven't built that in from the start, and we very rarely collaborate on those. So I think trying to build partnerships and opportunities to work together and relationships is really important. Identify the projects with real potential to influence policy, and then plan for that. Not all of our work can directly feed into the social policy process. Foundational scientific work is incredibly important, but excuse me, might not have direct impact for social policy. If you're developing a new construct, validating a new measurement tool, for example, the social policy implications of that might not be immediately relevant. But if you're conducting an RCT of a mental health intervention in schools, they probably are. So thinking about those ones which can really influence policy, and then start thinking at the start that we don't know the answers to this, but we know the people who we want to share that with, and how we're going to get to them, I think is important. Say more about the implications of your research for policy. I know there's not many points in a journal article for including this, but there's a discussion section. Can we say a bit more about what we think the research means now, and how it could be used? And if we can't do that within a journal article, let's think about other opportunities, policy briefings, writing blogs for organisations like EIF, podcasts and so on. Let's talk about what we think this research tells us for social policy. And I'd encourage you, possibly in collaboration with others, to think beyond sort of just general recommendations, government should consider X, into really thinking about who are the departments, is it the agencies, the organisations, the practitioners that need to be involved in this? Are there funding implications, accountability, inspection implications? Would it need new legislation and so on? So to get those sort of sharper, actionable recommendations that people can pick up on. And then I picked up on this earlier, make sure people outside academia are engaging with your work. I think there's sort of behavioural nudges one could put in place. Try to think, I will send every journal article I write to 3 people outside of the university, I think is one. But also, I think a bit wider than that. So was talking to a relatively senior professor recently, someone who's got a bit of media profile, and we're talking about the government reshuffle that happened quite recently, and new ministers coming into the Department for Education, and what that might mean for policy, and their hopes that they might be able to have a better engagement and get a discussion going about some of their research. And I said, have you written to the ministers, asked for a meeting? And they said no. I said, well, why not? Yeah, what have you possibly got to lose other than the time it would take to write a letter, and you can use that letter again and again every time there is a reshuffle. Yeah. And I think that probably speaks to the final point I've got here, which is just about the realities of what being a minister is like in a civil service department. Really, that's a series of engagements with officials on often very dry and technocratic issues, often where you're choosing between the least bad option before you run back to the House for a vote, and so on. And not all ministers, but many would really welcome the opportunity to chew the fat with people who really know a subject matter and discuss that. And I've seen that happen well. Most people do want to speak to experts, and it's not just ministers. This cuts across the whole social policy landscape. If you ask for meetings, if you ask for the opportunity to discuss things, more often than not, I think you'll get that opportunity. So I'd encourage you to think about that more as well. I think that's pretty much it from me. So I guess we'll stop there and ask for questions.
Great, thank you very much, Aleisha and Tom. That's been extremely informative and helpful. There's sort of more statements rather than questions in the chat. So there's a statement from Gemma about educational psychology and how there was a lot to consider from what you said from educational psychology perspective. And Gemma says that implementation was mentioned, and she said that you might have come across the implementation framework. And it's something that they use when they plan the change with schools, and apparently helps to address stage of change and cultural ethos. Is this something that you have evaluated and looked at, or is this something that is niche to Hampshire?
Yeah, so I think we are seeing much more, particularly in research applications as well, much more of a focus on monitoring implementation. But I think, I suppose the point I don't know if I'm answering the question, but the point I was making was, it was quite surprising, in terms of the evidence review, looking across 97 primary studies, there was a limited number that actually reported on it in their findings, implementation findings and their impact, where they had gone on to taken that step further to look at the impact of implementation on programme outcomes. And actually where they did do it, we could see it did impact. And I suppose, one of the kind of points we were making to government was, it's hugely important that we do invest more in understanding implementation and its impact, because we're seeing so often that programs aren't effective and we don't actually know why they're not effective. Is it because they were poorly implemented, as opposed to, the program just wasn't actually achieving its impact on outcomes?
Right. There's Niran Rahil has his hand or her hand up. I can't tell. There we are. Hi, Niran. I think you're muted.
Thanks, Essie. Hi everyone. So I'm Niran Rahil. I sit within the Department of Applied Health Research in UCL, but also in the mental health team at UCL Partners. Thanks for your presentations. Really, really interesting. I have seen some of your work several years ago around parenting, I think particularly in the early years, and that was really useful. I haven't seen anything more recently, so I'm excited to go and have a look after the presentations today. My question was around, you've touched on it in quite a few places, and this sort of comes from, I've worked for a few years earlier in kind of local government. And one of the challenges is kind of thinking, it's all very well understanding which individual interventions work very well, but when you're trying to deliver change across a whole population, you've talked about needing interventions at multiple levels in order to really see that change. And have you, in any of your sort of more recent work, thought about how you might recommend sort of like a composite strategy, what an evidence-based strategy would look like in terms of supporting kind of mental health at a population level, or is that something that you might look work towards doing in the future?
Do you want to have a first go at that, Aleisha? Or do you want to pass that on to me?
Great question. Do you mean in terms of like system change? So moving beyond interventions to understanding how interventions work at that kind of system level?
Yeah. That would be that would be one way. Yeah, kind of with a systems lens. Sure. Yeah. Or in terms of making, I suppose, before everyone started talking about systems, there was also kind of talking about making sure that you sort of have effective layers of interventions working at, I suppose, more traditionally a universal targeted and kind of more individual level. And so I suppose you could kind of collate across that, but I think the systems is probably more interesting and more relevant going forward.
It's something we're really cognizant of, you know, and whilst our guidebook is very much about interventions, that's not all of our work. We are very conscious of, you know, the whole system approach, and that's why we do a lot of, I suppose, have a lot of conversations with government around, in the context of schools, the whole school approach. And that it's not, you know, the one intervention. And I think it goes back also to the point around, I suppose, mental health is messy in terms of government because it sits across various departments and each department has a particular responsibility. Even, you know, in the context of mental health and behaviour, you know, we talk an awful lot about needing to even join those and operate at that kind of universal and targeted level as a unit. There's definitely an awful lot more work to be done in that space, I would say. Tom, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with it. This is incredibly challenging. I think it's something that the What Works networks or others talk about in the network quite a lot. You know, I suppose the point I would make is that what the What Works network's done to date has been predominantly, not exclusively, focused on the evaluation of programs and manualised interventions, because we understand how to assess those, and the sort of standards and approaches are pretty well codified. But I think everyone recognises there's a whole range of other interesting questions that need to be addressed. You know, from how one evaluates practice, how you evaluate system level interventions and place-based interventions and so on. And there is quite a lot of thinking going on around that, and our sister organisation, the Youth Endowment Fund, is actually making quite big steps in that space about how you go about that. But it is just much more methodologically challenging, I suppose, and something that just needs a lot more thinking.
There's a question in the chat from Rosa Town asking, as an individual PhD student working on a small project, what would you say is the best way to ensure the policy recommendations resulting from my research are heard by policymakers?
So say that again, Essie. You glitched out slightly.
If you're a PhD student working on a small project and you get findings that have policy implications, or you think have policy implications, what would you say is the best way to hear that the policymaker, or ensure that the policymakers hear about that research? How can a student try and get their findings heard?
Yeah, I mean, so one shouldn't be too naive about this, I guess, that you know, your chances of getting a meeting with a Secretary of State or something as a PhD student might be relatively limited, but there are, you know, I guess there's civil servants who want to hear about this, you know, and if you can find routes in to contact people directly, I'll definitely try that. But I think other, you know, just organisations who have got routes in, like EIF and other knowledge brokers, you know, they're probably your best route. You know, so if you're facing a huge government department with 3,000-4,000 civil servants in it, it can be pretty daunting to work out the points of access, I suppose. But you know, an organisation like EIF probably would know. You know, and again, it comes back. yeah, we're rarely contacted by people who say, yeah, I've done this work and I think it has real implications. Can you help me make sure it lands? So I think that's the approach I'll be trying to take, is, you know, trying to work through intermediary organisations who can help you find your way into complex government departments. Yeah, would be my advice.
And I would also add that it would probably, you would imagine that people do this in collaboration with their supervisors, who normally have a certain idea of what's going to make a splash, and the supervisors may also have more links and can also mobilize people within the institution who have contacts with the channels. So I would certainly not recommend a student going solo. I don't think that is necessarily going to result in a kind of a best outcome at any level. But talking to your supervisor, talking to the university channels as well, I think would be really, really helpful. Courtney, I think, was next.
Hi, and thanks. A lot of food for thought. I wanted to ask a question about kind of interdisciplinary approaches to these questions. So I'm a professor here and I work mostly with language and kids who have special educational needs. And I know the EIF primarily through your work on early interventions for language, but language has huge impacts on mental health. And I was particularly interested, Aleisha, in your comments on how little there is in terms of research around kids who have SEND, who are really vulnerable to having adverse mental health outcomes. So I just wondered, within your own organization, what kind of crosstalk is there between those two streams of work? And for someone who would like there to be more crosstalk, what's the strategy, or what would you advise in terms of trying to get people to be interested in kids with SEND, or thinking about how language might be a predictor of response to intervention and mental health interventions, which are really verbally mediated most of the time?
Yeah, challenging question. Yeah, like it's something that I'm particularly conscious of, given I lead the mental health portfolio, and as an organization, we are particularly concerned with, the outcomes of those who are most vulnerable, and it's possibly where the research is the weakest. We know a lot less about what works for, those who are at heightened risk of mental health difficulties. So I think we need to, as an organization, think more about how we can move into that space, and really, I think one of the challenges is it's fairly likely if we do, evidence synthesis in the space, it'll be the same findings, that there's limited evidence or there's no evidence. So the challenge is to try and make the case for doing more in this space, and make the case to policymakers. I guess in terms of what we can do, I suppose it's getting an interest group together across multiple disciplines who have that shared focus on mental health outcomes, and seeing what you can do with that collective voice to think about, project planning in the space, thinking about the research opportunities, but also, at that kind of more policy level, and what we can do through the likes of our making the case. It can be policy briefings, and trying to kind of think about with a group of like-minded people, what is it we want to present on in terms of the evidence, and really highlighting the gaps about in the evidence base.
There was an earlier comment that Courtney made in the chat about basically a lot of the implications being such that they actually require quite a lot of money. So we might know what works, but it's not cheap. And that is a message that is hard sell. And in some ways it's it's not about evidence, it's about values. So your values as to what to do with the evidence. So how do you kind of, as an organization, navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and one we've talked about a lot. I think first and foremost, where we sit in the sort of evidence ecosystem is as an organisation that's there to provide impartial evidence on the effectiveness of approaches. It's clearly for others to make the judgment about about those value judgments about what as a society we should be prepared to fund, and how much public money we should be prepared to commit to the various social policy endeavours. I mean, I think once you have an evidence base that something is effective, you can start to do sort of longer term economic analysis, and that's ultimately what Treasury is going to want. So very roughly speaking, for most things to get funded in government, you need some sort of plausible economic case that the cost will, the benefits will outweigh the costs. That they vary in quality incredibly, and some of them make some very heroic assumptions about the long-term impact and the monetizability of various impact. But that's when you get Treasury interested in funding something, and that's the point where you can start to have conversations which are about, yes, this is expensive, but the long-term benefits pay off. But the starting point for that has to be there's good quality empirical evidence that this actually works. I think good quality evidence it works in the short term is great. Good evidence that it works over the long term, that any improvements are sustained, is even better to start that conversation, I suppose. But yeah, you're absolutely right that all the evidence in the world doesn't necessarily mean that vulnerable children or mental health are going to shoot up the government's agenda.
Great. Are there any further questions? We're coming quite close to the end, but there's still room. No, there's Maxine has raised her hand. Maxine, do you want to ask a question?
Sorry, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I missed part of your presentation, so I do apologise if my question is been answered already. My sort of issue is, in terms of policy and mental health, is the issue about the study comes first and the participants come afterwards, meaning whereby schools and the community feel sometimes that the actual studies or the research doesn't reflect their views or what's really going on in the community. And I think sometimes it's a matter of actually getting the community to, or the schools to actually lead the research in much more participatory role, yes, rather than sometimes we put out some of these research, and sometimes the evidence is very strong, but is not being used, or it doesn't make an impact on the community or on the schools or the people that we're trying to serve. So I'm trying to look at those partnerships. I'm thinking about partnerships whereby we're reflecting those, and sometimes it's the cultural nuances that are the issues that the research doesn't necessarily always pick up, and also that influence on policy whereby there's more lobbying or more support from certain stakeholders to further that policy, because we always can see, particularly with certain things that have happened recently in politics, that if you have a community of people supporting it with research behind it or evidence behind it, a lobbying of people or stakeholders, it actually goes further. It's listened to.
Really, really important points, Maxine. I think Tom or Aleisha might want to say something. I know that Early Intervention Foundation is at the moment engaging in some work trying to address precisely these issues. So really glad you brought that up, Maxine. Which one of you would want to take that?
Tom, do you want to
say a little bit about this? Yeah. Were you passing that on to me, Aleisha?
Sorry, speak out, did you say? Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think it's a great point, Maxine, and one that we would fully agree. Putting the people at the heart of the research and research agenda, and really informing policy and next steps. So I suppose one example of work that we're doing at the moment is in relation to family support for minority ethnic young people, and we've done a whole series of research looking at what are the needs around family support, what are their experiences of family support, and using that information to try and influence some of the recommendations that are coming out of the care review. So we can see from our survey work, our focus group work with minority ethnic families and young people, that discrimination is a huge issue. Access to mental health services and support and family services is a huge, even awareness of what's available is a significant issue. And then within that, their experiences of the services. So we are just about to publish the findings from that work in the next 2 weeks, and working alongside the care review to try and hopefully have some impact there on the need to do more and to have that voice embedded in decision making.
Thanks, Aleisha. Now, I'm very aware that we're nearly at the end, so I'm going to sort of ask, is there any more questions? If not, I'm going to do a bit of advertising for the next events. No more hands raised, nothing in the chat. Thank you everybody for your contributions. It's been really, really good to have a lively and helpful discussion about this. And thank you in particular, Aleisha and Tom, for such a clear and wonderful presentation. And we hope that there will be many really fruitful research and policy collaborations between UCL people and yourselves. Just to advertise, our very last seminar of the academic year will be 8th of June, and this is on different causal inference approaches to understanding development of psychopathology in children and young people. And Jean-Baptiste Pingol and Francesco Solmi are giving talks, and they talk about different types of research designs you can use to strengthen causal inference. I'd also like to highlight that there will be an early careers event, and Patricia is going to post a link to the chat. So PhD students and postdocs, and if there are MSc students, please take a look and please come. It's an in-person event. It should be really exciting, and there's free wine, which should always be exciting. Okay, thank you everybody. And hopefully we'll see many of you 8th of June. And thank you again, Aleisha and Tom.
Thank you.